Imagine, the US Navy rejected the man who designed the boats, saying, "We won't buy them," and freezing him out for 5 years. But do you know that in the end, that same man was the one who won the war? Part 1. The ramp. You have seen it. Everyone has seen it. The shot is always the same. A low wooden box wallowing through gray water, packed shoulder to shoulder with men who are being sick over each other's boots, spray coming over the gunwale. Then the front of the boat falls forward into the surf, and the men go out into whatever is waiting for them. It is the single most reproduced image of the Second World War. It is on the cover of the books, and it opens the films. And if you close your eyes and think about D-Day, it is almost certainly the first thing you see. Almost nobody knows what it is called. The landing craft, vehicle, personnel. 36 feet of plywood with a steel ramp bolted to the front, a crew of 4, and room for about 36 men or 1 jeep. Everyone in the war called it the Higgins boat. More than 20,000 boats came out of one company's yards in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city with no naval shipbuilding tradition of any kind, in a state the Navy had no reason to think about, built by a man who was not a naval architect, had no engineering degree, and had spent his career selling boats to people the government would rather not discuss. 20 years after the war, Dwight Eisenhower sat down with a historian and said something about that man that is, if you take it literally, one of the most extraordinary claims anyone has ever made about the war. He said Andrew Higgins was the man who won it for them. He said that without those boats, the Allies could never have landed over an open beach, and that the entire strategy of the war would have had to be different. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe named a boat builder from Louisiana as the decisive figure. And the United States Navy had spent the better part of 5 years refusing to buy his boats. Part 2. 2 feet of water. To understand why the Navy did not want them, you have to understand what the boat was originally for, and it had nothing to do with war. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in Nebraska in 1886 and ended up in New Orleans in the lumber trade. That is the whole origin. He was a timberman, and the timber he wanted was in the swamps and bayous of southern Louisiana, in water that was, in places, less than 2 feet deep and full of submerged stumps, sandbars, floating logs, and mud. Nothing on the market could operate in that. A conventional hull draws too much, and the propeller is the first thing to go, because a propeller hanging below the hull in 18 inches of water over a stump is not a propeller for very long. So he designed his own boat, and he called it the Eureka. 2 features made it. The first was the bow, a broad, flattened, spoon-shaped forefoot that let the boat run straight up onto a mudbank at speed, take the ground, and then reverse itself off again without damage. The second was underneath, a semi-tunnel recessed into the bottom of the hull that housed the propeller up inside the boat's own shape, so that the propeller was never the deepest thing in the water. The hull hit the stump. The propeller did not. The result was a boat that could operate in roughly 1.5 feet of water, run over debris, beach itself, and retract. His customers were oil and gas prospectors pushing into the marshes, trappers, fur traders, and, this is not a rumor, Higgins was entirely open about it and appears to have enjoyed the reputation, rum-runners, during Prohibition, who needed exactly what a landing force needs: speed, shallow water, the ability to reach a shore with no dock on it, and the ability to leave again quickly. And the Coast Guard, chasing the rum-runners, bought them too. He sold to both sides of the same problem. Nobody designing that boat was thinking about war. Higgins was solving a commercial problem for customers who would simply stop paying him if the boat got stuck. That is the entire reason it worked, and it is exactly the reason the Navy would not touch it. Part 3. The Bureau. The United States Navy had a bureau responsible for designing and procuring its ships. It had its own naval architects, its own established relationships with established yards, and its own idea of what a landing boat should look like. It also had a problem it had been failing to solve for a decade. Through the 1930s, the Marine Corps had been building an entire body of doctrine around amphibious assault. The idea that a force could be landed against a defended shore, which most professional military opinion in the world at that time regarded as somewhere between extremely difficult and impossible. The doctrine existed on paper. What did not exist was the boat. The Navy's bureau produced designs. They were tested. They performed badly. They were poor in surf. They had trouble getting off the beach once they had landed, and the Marines who had to use them said so. Meanwhile, the Marines had been hearing about a boat in Louisiana. What followed was a fight that ran for years, and Higgins fought it in a way that no ordinary contractor would ever have survived. He was profane, enormous, permanently furious, and by every account got through a great deal of whiskey. He said what he thought about the Bureau's naval architects in public. He attacked them in the press. He took out advertisements. He appears to have regarded institutional politeness as a form of theft, since every month of delay was a month the boat did not exist. And the comparative trials kept producing the same answer. Put the Higgins boat and the Bureau boat in the same surf, and the Higgins boat won. In speed, in beaching, in retracting, in handling. The thing that finally broke the deadlock was not a trial. It was the United States Senate. In 1942, the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, the Truman Committee, chaired by a then-obscure senator from Missouri, looked into how the Navy had handled small boat procurement, and was scathing. The committee's finding was, in substance, that the Bureau had favored its own designs and its own contractors against clear evidence, and that this had cost time the country did not have. Harry Truman, before he was anything else, backed the boat builder from Louisiana against the Navy Department. The men in this story are a lumber dealer, a junior Marine officer, and 20,000 people in New Orleans nobody has ever named. If you think that's worth keeping visible, hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it puts them in front of people who care about getting this right. Part 4. Krulak's photograph. There was still one thing missing from the boat, and it is the thing you actually picture when you picture it. The ramp. The Eureka had no ramp. Men went over the side, into the water, holding their weapons over their heads, which is slow, which is loud, and which is a catastrophe if anyone is shooting at you. It also meant you could not land a vehicle at all. The solution came from an entirely unexpected direction, and the chain is worth following in full. In 1937, a young Marine lieutenant named Victor Krulak was in Shanghai as an observer while the Japanese were conducting amphibious operations against the Chinese. Krulak, small, sharp, later nicknamed Brute, eventually a lieutenant general, watched Japanese forces put troops and vehicles ashore from landing craft that had a hinged ramp in the bow. He photographed them. He wrote them up. He sent the report back through channels. And the report was filed and, by his own later account, effectively ignored for years. When the Marine Corps finally came to Higgins in 1941 and asked whether he could put a ramp in the bow of the Eureka, they brought that material with them. Higgins built it. Fast, the figure usually quoted is that he had a working ramp bow prototype in a matter of days, and while the exact number of hours gets repeated with more confidence than the sourcing really supports, every account agrees it was measured in days rather than months. What came out of it was the LCVP. 36 feet, 3 inches long. Plywood hull with steel plating on the ramp and around the coxswain. 2 feet of draft forward, about 3 aft, around 12 knots. 36 men, or a jeep and a dozen men, or 4 tons of cargo. 2 machine guns, a crew of 4. Follow that chain once more, because this is what the whole video is about. A junior Marine officer stands on a riverbank in China in 1937 and takes a photograph of somebody else's boat. The photograph goes into a filing cabinet. 4 years later, it is put in front of a timber merchant in Louisiana who has never designed a warship. He bolts the idea onto a hull he invented for oil prospectors in a swamp. 7 years after the photograph, that combination puts the Allied armies onto the coast of Europe. Part 5. The plant. Now the part that has nothing to do with boats and is, I think, the most remarkable thing in this story. Higgins Industries went from a small operation with fewer than 100 employees in the late 1930s to more than 20,000 people working across multiple plants in New Orleans by 1943. He had no established shipyard to expand. He built the capacity, and he built the workforce. The workforce is the part that stops you. In New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1942, in a fully segregated state, under Jim Crow, in the Deep South, Higgins hired black workers, white workers, women, elderly men, and workers with disabilities, put them on the same production lines, and paid the same wage for the same job. That was not normal. It was not close to normal. It was so far outside the ordinary practice of the time and place that it drew hostility, and Higgins, by all accounts, did not care. partly because he had decided it was right, and partly because he needed every pair of hands in the state and had no patience for any reason not to use them. I want to be honest about the limits of it, because it would be easy to overclaim. This was still Louisiana in 1942. Not everything about those plants was equal. Facilities and social lines did not simply dissolve, and there was friction. Higgins was not running a model of racial harmony. What he was running was an equal payroll for equal work, on an integrated line, in the Deep South, 2 decades before the Civil Rights Act. He hung a sign in the plants that said the man who relaxes is helping the Axis, which tells you roughly everything about his management style. He had also, before the war, done something that no ordinary businessman does. Anticipating shortages, he bought up enormous quantities of timber, including, by the usual telling, effectively an entire season's supply of Philippine mahogany, and stockpiled it. When the war came and materials were rationed and every other builder was queuing for allocations, Higgins already owned his wood. By the end of it, Higgins Industries had produced more than 20,000 boats. Not only the LCVP, the larger LCM that could carry a tank, patrol torpedo boats, support and supply craft, and the assault boats that put American infantry across the Rhine in March 1945. If your father or grandfather crewed a landing craft, worked in a wartime yard, or came ashore in one of these things anywhere, Normandy, Sicily, Salerno, the Pacific, the Rhine, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Name, unit or plant, and what he said about it. Most of them said very little. The families are the last people holding any of it. Verdict. 2 concessions before the verdict, because this one needs them. The first is that the Higgins boat was a wretched thing to ride in. It was a plywood box with a flat bottom, which means it did not cut through a swell so much as slam into it. Men were violently sick for hours before they ever saw the shore. They were soaked and freezing. They could not see out. And then the ramp went down, and everything on the far side of it came in at once. And at Omaha Beach, the first men out of some of those boats did not get more than a few steps. The design put the exit at the front. That is what makes it work as a landing craft, and it is also why the ramp, in the worst places, functioned as an aiming point. The second concession is Tarawa. In November 1943, the boats could not get across the coral reef because the tide never rose high enough, and men were put out 500 yards offshore and told to wade. The LCVP needed water under it. Where there was not enough water, it did not work, and the failure was measured in bodies floating in a lagoon. A boat that draws 2 feet is a miracle compared to a boat that draws 6. It is still a boat that needs 2 feet. Now the verdict. The Navy spent 5 years asking the wrong question, and it was an entirely reasonable question. It asked, who is qualified to build boats for the United States Navy? And it answered the way any large institution answers. Established yards, established contractors, our own naval architects, our own designs, our own people. Higgins never asked that question. He had spent 20 years answering a different one. What does a boat have to survive in 2 feet of water full of stumps, for a customer who will not pay me if it gets stuck? Those are not the same question, and only one of them produces a hull that can put a jeep on a beach in Normandy. The Bureau's boat was designed by people who had never had to get one off a beach and would not personally lose anything if it failed. Higgins' boat was designed under the only accountability that reliably works, which is a customer who stops buying. That is the thing worth taking away, and it generalizes well beyond boats. The war was full of institutions that could not tell the difference between being qualified and being right. What happened to him afterwards is the part nobody puts in the films. The demand for landing craft vanished at the moment the war ended, which is what happens to a company that makes exactly one category of thing for exactly one customer. Contracts were canceled. There were labor disputes. Higgins Industries came apart. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, 65 years old, and if you walk into a general bookshop today, you will not find a biography of him on the shelf. There is one detail I cannot get out of my head. During the war, Higgins was awarded an enormous contract to build cargo ships, and he built an entire new plant east of New Orleans at a place called Michoud to do it. Then the contract was canceled in the politics of 1943, and the plant he had built stood there with nothing to make. 20 years later, the United States government used that facility to build the first stages of the Saturn V. The rockets that went to the moon were assembled in a building put up by a swamp boat builder for ships he was never allowed to construct. Eisenhower's judgment was that without this man, there would have been no landing over an open beach and the whole strategy of the war would have been different. That is not a sentimental thing to say about a friend. Eisenhower had no particular reason to flatter a dead contractor from Louisiana. He was describing, in the flattest possible terms, a strategic dependency. An entire war plan rested on whether one difficult, foul-mouthed lumber dealer had happened to solve a problem about tree stumps. If this audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It puts this in front of the people who want the history the way it actually worked, not the way it looks in the films. Subscribe if you want the next one, because there are more of these. More men who solved something enormous by accident, in the wrong industry, for the wrong reasons, and got almost nothing for it. And remember what the Navy could not see for 5 years. The most important boat of the war was not designed for a war. It was designed for a swamp, by a man selling to people who could not afford to get stuck.